No.
Yeah, the first question is just really like, how do you describe your work?
Okay. If I'm describing it, depends a little bit, actually. If I'm describing it to someone who I want to get involved, either as a partner or an investor, or to work with me, I say that we are trying to create solutions to some of the biggest problems we face, and that we're doing that in a particular way, where we're kind of starting with people in their lives and trying to ground everything we do in their experience. If I'm talking to, what I would say is if I'm talking to someone who's maybe interested in policy or is interested in kind of the bigger picture, I might talk a bit more about the system that we're trying to work with. So if I were talking about, I rarely use kind of like the welfare state or kind of social public services in my answers, but I would talk a bit more about maybe big picture things that were happening with aging or unemployment or the government's view of its own role in society. So I might kind of talk about where we fit into that with kind of policy people, maybe a little bit with investors too.
And when you say that you tend not to bring sort of public policy or public service language into it, why is that?
My experience has been that people have a very different reaction when you're talking about a local authority or a council or a government department or kind of a major policy issue of the day. But if you start from people and their lives and kind of place it, I mean, maybe this is just telling stories and you put it in someone's life and you talk about how it's impacted, you can make them take off their hat for whatever battle they're in the trenches of fighting, which will be one of them. And it gives you a better chance of a fresh start. That's why I do that.
And on the same sort of question, how do you almost describe your work to yourself? So like when you're getting up out of bed in the mornings, like what is it that you have in your mind as to what you're doing and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do a mixture of two things, and I prefer one of them to the other. So I prefer the creating solutions, startup, bringing people together, both people who are using a service and people on the team. I prefer that side. But I think the reality of this kind of work, where we are engaging with kind of very entrenched ways of doing things and partners in both in local and central government and third sector organizations, that there's a bit of stakeholder management and project management in there that you can't help but approach things in a different way than you might if you were just a startup with some money and you spent it however you wanted to, and there was almost no, it's a very contested space. So I think that the part of my job I describe as kind of project management or innovation in that world. And then the other part's just kind of running a startup. I've often done that in my career with kind of a group of people. So my first startup was with 4 people. And since then I've tended to work in big groups to get those things done. I kind of prefer that model of kind of cooperative entrepreneurship, I suppose.
And has how you describe your work changed over time in the sort of, whilst you've been working at Participle, for example? Because I guess you've had the same sort of role but just on different initiatives.
Yeah, I think I've actually had different roles. I think that the way I describe it has changed over time for sure, and I think that's kind of in line with Participle's own growth as a startup itself. Because when I joined Participle 5 years ago, we had one project, or one that was really live out in the world, and that it was called Southwark Circle. It had a name that we all thought would be just a holding name, but it became its real name, which always happens, I will say. And at that point, I just came on to run that. As we did 3 more innovation projects in different areas, the role of kind of running the startups, the role that I have now, kind of came out of that. And I think that's also in line with what I've been realizing about myself and what I think my role is in this kind of work, which is that I like the beginnings of things. I like the kind of, I like coming up with a proposition and putting lots of it out there, and I think it plays to some of my strengths. So the role's kind of been shaped over time, and it's definitely true that I would say almost every year I describe it to myself differently, which is probably also a coping mechanism in there as well. But it's just linked to a lot of the way participles grow as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel that it's been quite equal in the sense that you've shaped the role and the role has shaped you, or has one had more influence on the other? Or?
I don't know. I definitely feel that it's a hybrid role, and it's constantly changing, and it depends a lot on the area of work. To give a small example, so between maybe working in aging and working with a lot of local authorities, and particularly adult social care commissioners, that's quite different to right now, where I'm, working in employment, and you're working with a job center advisor, and it's much less about the big bets and much more about kind of getting into kind of system change, the belly of the beast, kind of getting into a job center and working with a job center advisor, and then potentially trying to get as quickly as you can to working with people. So what I do changes based on the area. And I know this is also true of my colleagues who work in family services, where it's just depending on the area, you have different people who are kind of engaged with that. Whose problem is it, I suppose? In all of them, I feel that if I'm doing a good job, I'm getting as quickly as possible to the people who would use the service, and then getting them involved. But often there's kind of gatekeepers or people in the way, often for a very good reason. But it is still the goal to get straight to people and have them develop the service as much as possible.
I know it's really hard sometimes to describe yourself, like to describe what you're bringing to that, or your strengths. But what, a word that's very obvious is that you're adaptive, and like you say, it's constantly in flux, and you have to respond to what's needed at the time. But what are the other kind of attributes or characteristics you think your role requires?
Well, I did a personality test the other day, actually. It's called the Belbin. Do you know it? And I'm not sure if I like what it told me, but it's a bit different than Myers-Briggs in that it's more about your role in a team, and you kind of show different strengths, and less about kind of you as a kind of static state. So I think what it showed me was there's, I appear to prefer to take on the role of kind of coming up with new ideas, getting people kind of, and trying to influence people to take them up. I appear not to have much of an eye for detail, which is interesting. And there's some, obviously pros and cons to this, and a little bit about persistence and kind of not taking no for an answer is definitely in there. So being a bit stubborn. And I'm not sure that I am all those things, because I think I do actually have an attention for detail. I know that I should surround myself with people who are planners, who are quite good at to-do lists. But I think I do have an idea. It's just maybe the role brings those things out of me. And I think everyone does this, because I do Belbins for everyone I recruit. And I put kind of code words into the job descriptions too, because I think that how people work together and what roles they prefer to take is more important than maybe any one person. I think often in maybe startup space, we overemphasize the importance of one kind of lone genius, and don't appreciate as much the kind of the impact of two people with different strengths working together, or with a kind of group of people who are bringing different things. So that's why I like that kind of way of describing it. But I think, adaptability comes in handy, both for what strengths you might use yourself, and also in the work and how you have to be. I think that's what I would say.
The word persistence really is definitely something that's come through with some of the other. You're right.
Yeah, it's fine. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Some of the other interviews, and can you talk a bit more about sort of where have you had to? Can you think of an example where like persistence has really paid off, and kind of what your sort of tactics were around that?
Yeah, I can think of a couple. I mean, the first one that comes to mind, which might not be the best, is we raised a fair amount of money from the first local authority to launch a circle. And to get that through took a lot of time. And I learned about the local government scrutiny system, and I went to lots and lots of committee meetings, and it was difficult. I mean, we had to kind of discuss something. I mean, I guess the challenge of being persistent is that often in the early stage you're having to describe something with more certainty and maybe a bit more kind of, you have to describe it as almost a project with kind of outcomes that are going to happen in 2 years, when, a closer version of your expectations would be, well, we think this is what's going to happen, but we also, none of this could happen. But that's not as okay. So maybe the kind of comfort with risk is so different between if you're working with a local government, and in this case that was what I felt. It was really rough, and you had to be persistent about kind of going to these committees, or going to meet with counselors, and going to meet with people who work at the local authority, and kind of saying this is where we think we're going to go, but actually here's the big picture we should be thinking about, and kind of repeat that, and I guess not get stuck in kind of the language and the outcomes and the kind of goals of the old system that you're trying to innovate. And that's hard. And in this case, it took months and months, and some really rough moments.
What keeps you going through that?
I like a good street fight, actually, and that's definitely something I can say has been present in almost my entire career. I like a good argument, but it's not. I just think it's a game, and I did grow up in Washington D.C., where we've just. I don't want to date this interview, but we've just shut down the government. So I view this as all being a bit about who has influence where, and how can you gather support for something, and it's not. It tends to remove the morality or the ethics of it, and say like what's right or wrong in terms of a certain policy or a certain idea, and kind of makes it into more of a what can you get done. It's very relationship driven, basically.
And is there for you, is there always a belief about what you're trying to change, or how you think that?
Yeah.
So you have quite a clear vision about how it can happen, but you don't quite know how you're going to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite clear and at times angry that people settle for what the current situation is. I wouldn't say that I have an idea of exactly where it's going to end up, but not doing anything is really frustrating to me. I'm lucky to work with some people who have an incredible vision and can explain that in 3 sentences, and that's helpful to have. I think that what I'm certain about and what keeps me going through that is I've seen it work. I've seen where you can get people to believe in something and believe in the process, kind of the journey to get there. So that's what I would say.
This is sort of taking a step back in a way,
Mm-hmm.
but like what do you want to change in the current system? So it might be more helpful to think about one of, like maybe it's circles or maybe it's Backer,
Mm-hmm.
But like maybe if you could just describe a bit about what you see that system as being, and
Mm-hmm.
what you're trying to change in it.
Okay. I mean, if I can talk about employment and kind of Backer, that's easiest. I think the main thing that I want to change, and this is maybe a place where my personal beliefs happen to coincide with the kind of approach that, with the principles of what we think are a better solution. Because I know for a fact that I could have really used Backer when I was 20 years old, and I know that a lot of people can use it now, and I know that probably I'll need it in a couple of years. I think that for me, the main issue is that way that we support people to build their careers is so divorced from the way that it actually happens for millions of people in their real life. And that way that it's different is that for this one group of people, they use their networks and their connections, and they meet people and find opportunities and create opportunities and tell their story all the time, and they're confident in that because it's been validated by all these people they've met. And then there's another group of people who experience a very transactional service, which is around a certain course leading to a certain job that you get by your CV and an interview, and so you practice the formats that have been designed there. And for some of those people, that is itself also divorced from how they find opportunities or how they operate in other areas of their life. So, and this is just about using relationships for your career. And that's the main thing that I think really is at the heart of what we want to change. People create jobs all the time. People who wouldn't think to operate that way in their career use that to find a partner, a sale around the corner, find opportunities in other areas. But it's just that the language of the current system doesn't make that possible. It talks to you about what you could do. And so I meet people all the time who say, I want to be an office administrator. There's nothing wrong with that. Lots of people are for their whole lives, but that's not how they talk about it. I want to be an office administrator tells me that someone's told you that you could be an office administrator, because that's a title. That's not the way anyone talks who hasn't been programmed to say that or just bullied into it. And that's not helping anybody, because the future is not going to be working for the same company for 50 years as an office administrator. The future is going to be you are constantly repotting yourself. And it's not, I think the main issue is that this will require a much bigger change than anyone realizes. It will require, all the things we do to tell our story are very limiting. So the CV, the way that we recruit, the way that we interview, the way that we interview people for 2, possibly 3, 45-minute sessions to tell whether we're going to work with them for 2 years is a joke. I mean, it's an absolute joke, and there's no easy solution to that. But that whole mentality is we're leaving people behind, and it's definitely preferencing people who are maybe more extroverted, because they practice that, they get energy from that situation, so they're out there talking to people all the time. It's definitely the skills you need for that are you have to be able to tell your story, and we're not working with people on that. So in that format, we're not even helping people in the current system with the skills they need. But the main thing is relationships, and that's the main thing that I think is really, really frustrating. And even yesterday, we had an event in a cafe, and most of the people who were there had just joined back, or almost directly from the job center, because we're recruiting in job centers now. And they were talking, and you could see that the way they were talking to each other was different than the way that they might inside a job center. Because just by showing up and being in a normal, friendly environment that was not institutionalized, where there was no threat where benefits was completely out of the equation, they looked at each other differently. They traded emails. They talked about things. And obviously, within that group, we want to have people who have opportunities, small business owners, people who work in places. There's a big mix of people. But even with just people who had already met in the job center, talking outside the job center, there was a change. And that's much closer to the way the world looks. That's much closer to an open vision. And we saw people trading emails, talking about brothers and sisters who do that. I can connect you to him or her. Those things don't happen in a job center. They don't happen in that environment. So just changing the context in which people are meeting is a first step. But then I believe if we create a system where people are building relationships and making these connections, and that's the way they operate, and it leads to, and everyone functions that way also, small businesses and larger organizations start to think about the way they meet people as being more relational. I think that's really the change. And it'll take a while.
That sort of links to the next question, which you've already answered some of it, around sort of how do you think change will happen in what you're trying to do. But maybe, because you have kind of covered some of that, maybe you could just talk a bit about how far ahead do you are you planning? You know, like so you know, what's your? I don't want you to tell us all your strategy because that's. But I'm interested in how far ahead are you planning this? And
for this, I mean, for Backer, we're planning about 2 years ahead, and the reason is because we want to see if it works, and so. And the reason we're doing an independent evaluation, actually, which is scary, but really will be positive either way. And the reason is because it is quite a big change. I mean, the way that this system is proposed as a way to help people build their career, so it's about employability, not employment, is such a big shift from the way that the welfare to work system operates, that we know we need to show with a kind of limited regional or kind of local example that this could work for this group of people. So we're doing a kind of randomized control trial over a 2-year period to show how it's different and what the outcomes are of that. And the other reason we're doing it in that space is because the central government budget that's the DWP is the only person who really funds this kind of work in the country. So that's the way it is in that. In other areas, we've planned for kind of 5-year delivery cycles. So with Circles, as an example, we had the thinking was really to try launching Circles in 5 or 6 of the kind of proxy different contexts of the UK. So it might be an urban area, a semi-urban area, kind of maybe suburban, a rural area, so London, a Midlands city, a northern city, kind of West Country. So trying to picking and choosing from those and running those over at least a 3-year period, and all of those over a 5-year period. So it was like, here's how this might look in all of those different places. So there was kind of a 0 to 1, 1 to 5, and then 5 to 10. And I think it changes. In both those cases, you'll notice that the commonality is that it's kind of around business development and thinking about who would fund it in the future and what would make it a sustainable service. So it does tend to be in line with how commissioners are working, or how we think, or the cycle of development. So for the DWP, a couple things are happening. The work program is running for that 2-year period too. So there'll be a natural period of review, and also there'll be a national election. With Circles, it was a lot more around how does the business look after that period of time with thousands of members. My first venture in Argentina, we did things kind of annually, and the reason we did that was because we wanted to see if we could. At that point, we were trying to change a diaspora's perception of what their role in the country was, or at least help them to realize what they wanted their role to be. And it was just easy to kind of say, this year you did that, and every year we kind of marked time by that. So we had no kind of business development or kind of partnership reason to do it. So I think most people do it by an annual strategy. But I guess we have to think a bit further ahead.
Ready? So going back, just what we've been talking about, or you were talking about, in terms of how you build a roadmap or strategy. How much are you influenced by the current system in doing that? So, for example, with the job centres and with Backer and taking people outside of them and creating a space for more connectivity and relationship building, that's obviously working with parts of the existing system, but you're doing something differently with it. So how can you just talk a bit more about where the existing system and the new system you're trying to create overlap?
Okay. It's difficult. I mean, I don't have a great answer to this because it's a constant kind of, even this morning I was thinking about different strategies we might use. So maybe in answering it, attempting to answer it, I'll break it up maybe by how we operate in different stages of development of a new solution, or how I think about it. So in the kind of ideation or coming up with a solution and working with people stage, we definitely kind of interview and engage people who work in the existing system. So in the case, whether that's a social worker or an employment advisor or a care worker for an older person, or carers, people who just in their life who care for them. We try to bring them in the very early stage and find people who are open to thinking differently, but also interview people who are completely closed off to that, so that we can build in at least a little bit of, so we can build in their thinking. As we think we've got something that works, or as I think I can see that there's a potential some traction for an idea, and we're running it, then we might be looking for early adopters only for a little while. So I would be looking for an employment advisor who is a bit wacky, a bit off the wall, and then try some new ideas. I mean, I can think off the top of my head, when you meet people who run job centers, that there's some people who are really open to innovation, and there's some people who are really, really committed to no one does it for the money, like in this way. They're really, a lot of people are very committed to supporting people. So I look for those, and our team is very good at that too, for looking at people who will be good on the ground kind of partners. So there's some early adopters there. Now, as we are growing, we're kind of coming back to really needing to engage people in the existing system who aren't open to it, who might even be scared to talk, or who might just be completely overwhelmed with what's happening. So it's not that they don't want to, it's just that that's just too much to think about. And there's targets, and there's the normal, there's no reward for that in what they do. So there's no reward to being innovative in probably some of these roles. So we try to engage with different people in different stages. So speaking about right now, how we work with the existing system, I think there's different strategies. I really believe in kind of an A/B testing type thing, where you're trying one way of engaging here and then a different one there, and figuring out which one is best. And we're kind of, I think, doing that for a long time, years. Mainly because, and included in that A/B, mainly because you just don't know. And a lot of the behavior change aspect to the services will take a while until you can see that someone's kind of life has changed, that they're operating differently, that they're more confident, their self-esteem has grown. That takes a while, and that's what we're kind of looking to see in the end, and measuring. And the other thing is that it's not always clear that you need to engage with the existing system. Some cases you don't really, and no one really wants you to. In other areas, it seems like you have to, and not just because of legal or very practical reasons. In some cases, it's just better to operate in a kind of parallel universe for as long as you can, and then kind of port people over to the new world when you've shown that it's a great place to be.
Have you got any more sort of concrete examples of that? When it's worked, waiting and sort of almost being under the radar and creating this other reality, and when you've more visibly and actively been trying to sort of nudge them all the way through? Yeah, I can think of examples that I've been involved with and examples that I haven't been involved with. I think a concrete example of developing things outside of the system is definitely, my experience developing circles was definitely that way. We didn't have a lot of referrals from, adult social care, social workers for a while. And that was fine, because there are many ways to meet people. People also walk around the streets, and so you can meet them. And that really worked because we wanted to build a different, it was really important that there was a different language and a different approach and a different kind of experience of being a member of a circle. I think it's harder with something like Backer because there is a place where everyone who is seeking a job goes in this country. And it's just crazy not to go and try to engage with that group. Like, if we were starting an ice cream business and there was an ice cream eaters center where 2.5 million people went every fortnight, we would probably want to go meet ice cream eaters there, So it is a bit crazy not to engage with it, but it's also necessary because ultimately that is the place where, they are trying to support people to build their career. And although it does mean you're maybe doing more you're doing some kind of
I'd call it like B2B or whatever you're doing, like our team is very much working with advisors and working with people who run job centers and talking about what's the best way to get the message out. You know, we didn't really spend that much time in circles doing that. And waiting was really helpful because it allowed that kind of different world to grow. I think we're doing a bit of that with Backer, but it's not, we can't be as completely outside the system. So we'll see where it goes. We'll see if it works or not. I know from our family's work it's impossible to be outside the system, and I know you know about this as well, like, because of the nature of it, you have to be kind of inside the system, and working with families means you're also engaging with multiple kind of departments, and you can't really be completely outside that world. It'd be impossible. So, you know, the nature of the system, I suppose, dictates a little bit how much you can be outside of it when you're trying to change it.
And I've just had a sort of visual in my head then of like, do you have like a chart almost up on the walls of Participa that sort of says, I know you don't, but I'm just thinking, you know, like what type of system it is, and therefore what type of way to work with that. I mean,
that'd be interesting.
Would it map out in that way at all, do you think? Or
I think there's definitely, I think we're very small, so we only kind of have 5 areas of work, and I think for all of them it's really obvious. So in our health work, I mean, you really also can't be completely outside of the system in that world. So I think it's just kind of something we think about from the very beginning, and it dictates how we work from the very beginning. And I think this is probably true of everybody who works in this space, that they're very aware of, you know, what the big things coming on the radar are, who are the big players in that space, who you really kind of need to like you to even, you know, get the word out. And I think this is probably where policy comes into play a lot. And it's not my area of expertise. I don't really even like it that much, actually. And I think that is a big thing, because people aren't even open, in many cases, for a conversation if it's not on their agenda. And they use the word agenda, like this is part of the something agenda. And if it doesn't fit on any of those agendas, it's kind of not there. So you do have to kind of find your way to curl it in there.
And that links to the next question, which is, like, do you feel like an insider or an outsider?
Yeah, an outsider for sure. Yeah.
And can you talk a bit more about how that actually feels for you as a person working in that way?
Mm-hmm. If I didn't feel like an outsider, I would try to create the situation where I did, because I find that easier, just from a motivational standpoint. Like, I find it easier to think of a kind of maverick banded outsiders. It's kind of like a God needs the devil thing. Like, I think every startup needs some version of that. Like, you know, you need something that, not in a mean way, that you're like kind of trying to, you know, because like system change or regime change, right? You could think there's not like, there are different words of saying it. You could think of it as, you're kind of, you're an outsider, you're looking in, you're trying to create a change, or you could just think, I'm doing my own thing. So, I don't know.
What does being an outsider give you?
A lot of freedom to innovate, for sure. And I do talk to a lot of people who are like, gosh, you guys get to try those things. I wish I could do that. So it's not that, you know, people are kind of set in their ways and they don't want to be involved in this kind of work. I think being a foreigner is fairly useful in this regard. I don't have much history I didn't grow up here, so I don't have any kind of vested interest, or I have no scar tissue of having the way things were taken from me. And so, like, you know, I'm not. It's useful in that regard, but you don't have to be this way, obviously. But it's quite easy, because I am literally a foreigner and outsider, so I can kind of. I'm not stuck to any way of doing things, which just helps me to be the way I would want to be anyway, I suppose.
So it doesn't have a sort of negative impact on
No, I think not at all.
It's the opposite.
Yeah, I think, I want to be an insider in the sense that, you know, it's really important to have relationships with people who are in positions to, support you or help make decisions, or who have, a really interesting take on things, who've maybe done something like this before, and they might be on the inside. So I don't kind of make a distinction between the people I try to talk to, but I think for my role in system change, it's really helpful to be an outsider.
And how do you work with other organisations or people within organisations, not just the organisations themselves? Like what's your sort of relationship with other?
Yeah. Do you mean like people like the Job Center, or like investors, or like other services like Good Gym, kind of delivering services, or kind of
all of those, really?
All of those.
Yeah.
Because it's very different between them. I mean, I think. I definitely know that my personal preference in this work is to build a kind of secret garden and test it. And I know that because of that mentality, I'm probably not fantastic at working with like my peers or like other services, just because I think focus is a really important thing to have, and I don't like losing it. I can feel when I've lost it, so I know that probably means I'm not as good at that as I could be, but luckily there are other people who are good at it who I work with, and as we have, as the secret garden starts to bloom, they can do their work and kind of find other people who do great things and kind of see where there are, good areas to collaborate. So I'm probably not a great collaborator in that sense. I think I am better finding individuals from large organizations or people who can come work like literally with our team, and seeing where their strengths and their unique skills or things they've experiences can really be useful. So that's like I'm better at kind of building coalitions, I guess, if you like, in that way. In terms of working with partners, I think I kind of view my own role as to help, is to kind of go on a journey together, I guess. And I don't like the word journey, but what I mean by that is usually we're talking to somebody because they have an interest in a certain area. They, either it's a focus for their investment, or they see a big problem coming up, and we're kind of a way to test some ideas. And I just want to make sure I can share how things are going and develop the relationship by sharing the good and the bad, and kind of gaining trust by also sharing the bad, and kind of, but always trying to be solutions focused where I am. So saying, okay, well, that's really not working at all, and we expected that, right? Like you expected everything wasn't going to work out, and kind of over months and years kind of building up trust on that basis. So again, that's maybe more partners in the sense of like funders or investors or delivery partners in the same way. So with the Job Center, that's how I choose to operate. Like I know that they have a lot of stresses. Like if someone who runs a Job Center has so much on their mind, they have monthly targets. It's a really tough economy, and that's what they're thinking about necessarily. And so when they're working with us, they're part of an innovation journey to see if we can, move the dial a bit. At the same time, for the ones that are really into it, I know that they can also see that there might be something they could build into how they work, and they're interested in that. They just don't have the time to work on it. So kind of making it easy for them to get involved is a really important thing. Kind of sharing information in a way that's easily consumable, and kind of helping them, sharing what's working and not working, and then getting their input on what might work better. So I think there's a kind of communication aspect to it that's really important in that.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Yeah, of course.
So one question is around, you talked a bit earlier about, it's almost like testing. You might have quite a few secret gardens, or your secret garden's got all these little pockets where you're testing things out. And I'm interested to know, when do you know to stop testing? Like, what are the things that are kind of signs for you that no, it's time to sort of fold this down, or let this go? Or
yeah, I'm not very good at that. I would say first, I think this two sides of the same coin. Like the pro of my approach to doing these things is that I am quite persistent and a bit stubborn, and then the con would be that I'm not as good at letting go. So I think that, but you know, it is, I just think when you set these things up, you have to figure out what you want to achieve. So that might not be the kind of numbers. It might be something about, it could be anything, but setting up kind of what the ultimate goal is, and the real one, not the kind of vanity number of this many people are involved or this much funding has been raised, but thinking about really what the kind of goal was and just being quite disciplined about whether you're achieving that and giving yourself a time frame before you start and sticking to that. So I try to use process in those moments to keep me honest, because otherwise I just know that I keep tinkering. I don't really want to stop. Yeah.
And then the last question is just, what do you need to be able to do your role?
Okay.
And that might be from, sorry to interrupt, that
That's
might be
right.
from your colleagues, the organisation that you work for, your peer, but yeah, just broadly, what do you need?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, so the first point for sure is, great people to work with. Because as I've said, I really do think that this kind of work requires, a lot of people working together in a kind of coordinated way. And within that, maybe leaving some space for a couple people to be doing kind of wild shots on their own. And then maybe somebody who's just seeing how it's all going. And to do this, I do think you need a great team, and that's what I need. And in talking to other people who kind of do a role like mine in completely different areas, I can see that we all feel that way, that it is kind of the work of the group. I definitely need really great partners, so kind of funders, investors. It's really helpful to be asked the right questions and to be pointed towards questions I hadn't thought of asking. That's really, really helpful, and I've experienced good and the bad. Time. I mean, we didn't arrive in the situation we are in overnight, and it's going to take some time to, figure out a solution that works. Yeah, I would say so. Great people, great partners, and time. And then, yeah, obviously, I think the early adopters are probably the fourth group I would talk about. It's a fantastic thing, and I know it's a bit of a buzzword, but if you can find people who are willing to test something and tell you why it works or doesn't work for them, and that's just such an incredible thing to have. And getting that kind of early feedback, it's so useful. And I think that there is a point where they become less useful, because you're kind of getting towards a more mainstream attitude or a kind of more mainstream feedback about your product or service, and those things and the things that might have been important just to get it out the door become less important. But if you don't have early adopters and people who can test it out with, well, I guess you don't deserve to exist. If no one's adopting it early, then you probably won't make it. So those are the four, I would say. Yeah.
Great. Have you got is there anything else that you would want to
There is
say?
one thing
Yeah.
I actually thought about. And I think, I don't know, where kind of I know this is kind of quite exploratory about systems change, and I don't know exactly what you're thinking about, where it's going to go, but I do think it's really, really related to two things. So the first is to the relationships, to the kind of relationships between the people who are innovating the systems. I'm a huge fan of Nikola Tesla, as an example, and kind of just looking at the whole the creation story of kind of with him and Edison and all the people who were involved in that, the relationships between them I thought were so important, and there were so many people involved in that story. So I think that's really important, and looking at where you have really constructive relationships with people with different skills. I think that's probably not something that's been investigated a lot. And I think it's critical. And again, it flows with the idea that actually it's not just one person. And then the other point is that I think that the system change that system change is really related to behavior change. And I think there are definitely some lessons that all the same people who are working in it could share with each other. I know some of the most important things I've learned over the last kind of 10 years, and really intensely over the last 5 years with Participle, have been in, I could summarize them all through behavior change. From kind of how much money and time you waste working with people who aren't open to change, to kind of the effort and kind of the importance you need to attach to triggers and when people are open to change and all that stuff. I just think there's kind of a lot of work in that. And it's not just marketing, and it's not just, the right message to the right person at the right time. I think there are some lessons that can be learned in that space, and I think they're really critical for system change because they're just people operating in that system. And it's not tricking anybody, but it's just saying there are moments when people are open to that, and there are moments when they're not. And I think that's I think that could be a really interesting focus. And so the two would be the relationships between the kind of main actors who are really working in a space to change the system, and then also the kind of approach they take to behavior change and what works and doesn't work. I think those are the two most
And in
important
terms
things.
of the behaviour change stuff, who do you think is doing really good work in that area? Apart from obviously.
No, I don't know. I don't know if we're the leaders in that space. I think we're trying. Yeah, there's a lot of people who I know of who are doing it. I find it really hard to tell who's doing good work and not. Because I don't know if it's, because it just takes so long. I mean, I think that it's probably some of the best people doing work are in kind of tech startups or in, or doing it by force in other areas. I just think I don't know how much there is to learn, but from that second one, from the latter. But I'll come back to you on names. I mean, I can think of a lot of people. Like I know maybe this is a cop-out, but I don't think it's like, I'm not as big a fan of kind of nudge way of thinking, and I'm
because that doesn't really shift underlying.
I just think it takes, a nudge. Like I'm not saying I think it takes a stronger force than a nudge, but I just think that makes it sound really easy. I just don't think it's helpful to make it sound easy because it's hard. If you're trying to get people to not like we're in a urinal and you change the color, whatever, that's great, but that's not, long-term unemployment. So maybe a nudge is good for kind of frivolous issues like that, but I don't think it's really helpful for bigger problems because I don't think people really engage with complexity unless they have to. And, it's hard. It takes a long time. And I think you could break it down. Certainly the triggers point, that's one that I think has been not very deeply explored. Just that there's sometimes, for example, like we would constantly looking for triggers for when someone would join a circle. So I would look for like people who are like recently bereaved, trigger. They might not have been open to, but there's a little one. Or obviously people when they're back or when they're made redundant, obvious trigger, but maybe not as good because your confidence is shot. So maybe has to happen maybe 3 months after that when you're kind of putting your head above the parapet a little bit. And I don't know. So I think but being really quite smart about those and testing them and finding when those are, and then from the trigger and thinking about how the system can be sustained. I think there are some things. I mean, I wrote a bunch of them down because I was interested in. Have you seen how Harvard Business School tried this whole approach to so Harvard Business School tried a 2-year test to think about, because they basically had men and women coming to do degrees, and although they tested the same, like their test scores were the same and their career experience today was the same when they came into Harvard Business School, when they came out, women were like a very small percentage of the top performing students and a very small percentage of the lecturers as well. So they did a 2-year experiment to see if they could make it more balanced, so the way you came in was the way you left, and they overhauled. It was a system change. It was a behavior change experiment, but they wanted to change the system of their MBA program, and they've evaluated it now after 2 years. And there's some very interesting things. I can send you a link. There's a big New Yorker article about it. And the thing about it was they did a 2-year experiment, but then all the people who were there are now going out into the world that doesn't look like the secret garden they created for 2 years. And so that's not really going to work. So I think within that, I kind of wrote up some of what I thought were the lessons or the things that were obvious to me about why that didn't work, and the things that were probably going really well. I can't remember it now.
That's all right.
But,
I'll email you.
okay, cool.
That's all right.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. That's brilliant.
Cool.
Thank you.
Good, I hope it was helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.